So last week, I said that we were going to finish our parables this week. And then I went to do a little review, and I just realized there's too much that I want to say. And so the title of this sermon is Oops, because we're not finishing today. We're not finishing the parables today. Got a little long with other stuff. And so, before we come to the final three of Matthew's 7 parables in chapter 13, I want to review some more stuff and consider some things anew. So this is part A of concluding the parables. And I'm intending for there only to be a part B. So next week we'll do part B and we'll conclude the parables. But for this morning, yes, the sermon is titled Oops, because we didn't get quite where I thought we were going to get. We're going to seek today to bring together the last month of Sundays into a nice, neat package that will prepare us for the next 3 parables. I've heard many of you are wrestling with the approach that we're taking, and it's new and even challenging because we've so westernized our thinking from a wisdom culture to a knowledge culture. And the learning of the parables is crucial to how we will read the rest of Matthew's gospel. And it tests how we've read his gospel to this point. So our review is going to set up a few key things in our mind one more time. And more fun for me, it's going to give us a chance to look at a few different twists in the parables. But first, the parables, as we've considered, are meant to defy clear answers. Parables were rabbinic tools that were meant to initiate deep thoughts in the students. And to the point that we claim parables are simple and easy, and we give them just a clear answer that takes just a couple seconds to arrive to, we make them no longer parabolic. If we think the parables of Jesus are so plain that their meaning is super clear, then we're claiming that Jesus was a horrible rabbi. His parables aren't really parables. The parables of Jesus, though, are like most rabbinic parables. I trust that Jesus was a good rabbi. He knew what he was doing, and he could throw out some parables among the best of them. And so his parables are like the other rabbinic parables in that they were never meant to actually give most any answer to a question. They were meant to lead us to wisdom, to thinking, to wrestling. Parables were meant to defy our presumption of our own mastery. The parables are meant to master us. They master us by making us students of wisdom rather than memorizers of just the right answers. Wisdom begins by realizing we don't have all the answers. That's where wisdom starts. This is why Jesus tells his disciples he's using parables with the mob set before him. The mob before him thinks they understand what is going on. Here is our Savior, and it's time for war. We're going to throw off Rome. In seeing and hearing Jesus, they're not really seeing and hearing Jesus because they're not getting it. They aren't understanding what they think they're understanding. And Jesus' parables are intended to wake them up to their lack of understanding. The mob has gathered before Jesus, and they are ready for the clear orders. Let's go kill some Romans. Jesus instead starts serving up one parable after another. He doesn't give them what they're looking for. The parables are how Jesus bypasses mob power, because Jesus will not establish or advance his kingdom upon the powers of this world. A couple of chapters earlier, as we've considered, Jesus tells his heavenly Father, I'm so grateful that the kingdom has not been given to the co-opting powers of the elite rulers of our day. Instead, it's bypassing those who would co-opt it, and it's going to the common people. But now the common people have gathered before Jesus. But they're no longer simply people. They're no longer simply people who can be loved and known by Jesus individually. The common people have amassed into a mob that is ready to be co-opted. But Jesus is grateful to have bypassed the powers of the rulers who would co-opt his gospel, but neither will Jesus himself become a co-opter of the mob. Jesus will not harness the power of the mob, the worldly power. Mobs are where my personal agency is hijacked. I become hostage to group think. It will cause me to do things I will never think in my entire life I would have otherwise done. Ask the numerous baptized Christians who joined the Nazis. Groupthink will change us from who we are to what the mob is. Mobs are run on the unification of simplicity and uniformity, typically around base instincts of anger and hatred and things like that. And parables combat the mob dynamic because parables are not simple. And neither, in our experience of the parables over the last month, are parables uniform. Here's a progression of understanding the parables. Parables are at the core of the foundation of the church. Jesus, we saw in Matthew 13, is beginning to form his church and prepare them for when he will leave and when they'll have to stand on their own. And parables is where he starts. Parables are not meant to have a clear answer or any answer at all. Parables defy the powers of the world because without clear answers, the rulers of the world can't claim to have mastered them and then hand out their mastery to people. They can't be co-opted. Without clear answers, the parables defy the power of the mob as they pull each person away from the mob mind and back into their own faculties to think through the parable. Parables illuminate me to me. I must first face the implications of what I was so quick to think was the right answer. And I can often be shocked at the first answer that I came to once I can get past it. Once I let the parable actually be parabolic and I let it pull me deeper, I can often be shocked at my first shallow answer. Parables bring us time and again to the first step of wisdom because they make me understand how much I don't understand and how I will never understand it all. Parables as the place where Jesus begins to establish his church. Parables bring me to trust Jesus rather than my mastery of everything he says. Parables, as we said last week, don't fix my ignorance. They highlight my ignorance. They teach me how to be ignorant when I don't have all the answers. The church is established in parables in order to trust the one who speaks to us before I ever come to understand everything he ever says to us. The parables prepare me for an entire life where I will come into one situation after another where I feel I am in over my head and I don't have the answer. Ultimately, parables act upon me to shape me. And as Chris Green said, as I quote Chris Green last week, as he says, this is how we approach the parables. As I listen to this parable, as I experience this parable, what happens to me? Not what am I learning, but how am I being shaped? What is happening to me? So we've experienced the parables for the last few weeks. We have the first field parable of the sower and the seeds and the 4 types of soil. And the church likes to make this sound simple. In our very human us versus them thinking, I make me and my group the good guys. We're the good soil. Look at all those rotten people out there who are the bad soil. It's us, them thinking. And the church typically believes that this parable is so simple and clear. If I can trust that I'm part of the church, I get to place myself up over others as the good. And those who reject the gospel are bad soil people. They have chosen to harden their hearts or fill their lives with things that don't let the gospel thrive in their lives. But we dug deeper and we realized that Jesus says the seed is not simply the gospel, but it is more broadly any kingdom word, any message the kingdom wants to give me. And in my own life, the kingdom is always giving me messages. In my own heart, the seeds of those messages, they find all the soils present. Sometimes the kingdom word finds soil that is ready for it. Sometimes the kingdom word finds soil in me that's not ready yet. And often, the good and bad soils that are in me and in each of us, they're not simply my own fault. Others have my eternal gratitude, and they have helped to make key places in my heart good soil. They've helped me make good soil in my heart, and others have helped through abuse to trample and destroy the soil of my heart. So one day I find I am the person where the word of the kingdom finds good soil, and it roots and it will thrive. And another day, I find I'm the person where the word of the kingdom finds bad soil, and it's not going to make it. So the challenge of this parable is that it's not just an us-them parable. The challenge of this parable is that it just might reveal how quick was I to jump to claim I'm good and they're bad. The challenge of this parable continues when it just might force me to consider that within me are good and bad soils. I have soil that's ready for seed. I have soil that is filled with hard places, filled with rocks, and I have soil that is trampled completely under the feet of this abusive world. And I have soil that has weeds in it. And so speaking of weeds in my own heart, we came last week to the second field parable, the parable of the wheat and the weeds. We find a field that is filled with good seed and bad seed. It's respectively the children of the kingdom and the children of the devil. And the good and the bad seeds, are the weeds. They're the children of the devil, and they're going to be thrown into the fire of a furnace. And right off the bat, our human, us good, them bad, it kicks off right away. And I tell Jesus, you're a horrible rabbi because your parables aren't even parabolic. This isn't even hard for me to see. Obviously, you're speaking of how great I am and how horrible they are out there. They have rejected you. They do bad things. They're the weeds that pollute our world, and I can't wait for them to enter the fire so my world is perfect. That's where our human mind goes to. But we need to be worried if we think that the meaning of the parable lies so clearly on its surface, because it's not how parables work. Even more, we need to be worried if the obvious meaning of the parable makes me feel safe and comfortable where I am. And I'm elevated as the good one. Digging deeper, we realize that the weeds are the ones who do bad things. And they're all actually who do bad things, is what Scripture says. and they'll go into the furnace. And Jesus doesn't say, only those who do bad things that don't have me will go into the furnace. Jesus says, all who do bad things will go into the furnace. And that's me. Just like Paul writes about his own experience, that he too often, he says, I'm a Christian and too often I do bad things. Paul's calling himself a weed. Even more than the bad things I do, we also read that the weeds that will be burned also include the sources of stumbling. All sources of stumbling will go into the fire of the furnace. Well, wait a minute. I'm getting uncomfortable here because I too often mess up. And I too often make people stumble. I too often am a source of frustration for others. I don't speak to them out of a kingdom of love too often. I speak out of my own humanity. And I come to realize when I let this parable actually be parabolic, and I go a little bit deeper, I start to realize that it's very possible that the wheat and the weeds are both in me. And we just came to realize, like the last parable last week, we considered it just might be that I may have the weeds in me as well. Within me are both the parts of me that are the children of the kingdom and the parts of me that are the children of the devil. Peter's experience lives this out as he called Jesus, you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus says, there's Peter, the child of the kingdom, because the kingdom has given this to you. But a minute later, Peter says, Jesus, you are not going to go to the cross. I'm not going to let this happen. And Jesus says, there's the Peter who's the weed. There's the Peter who's the child of the devil. Step back, Satan. They're both in us. And digging deeper than my extremely embarrassing, often too human reaction to these parables that would initially put me as good and all of them as bad. Digging deeper, I strive to move past my continual feeding off of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I have to set down the fruit of claiming to know good and evil. I'm good. They're evil. It tastes good to eat that. And I have to realize that my own experience and the experience of at least Peter and Paul might mean that I'm to take this parable to mean that both the good and bad seeds are in me. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we Christians will go through what's described as a fiery purification experience. That's what we're looking at here. The Jason who is the weed of stumbling for others. Too often, the promise of this parable is that eventually that Jason who impacts others negatively, that Jason will go away. The Jason who is the weed of doing bad things. This parable just might promise that Jason will ultimately go away. I have at least a half dozen other ways to understand these parables. So maybe the understanding I've offered is what they mean. Or maybe these understandings are off a little bit or off a lot. What is at least the right answer to this parable is the clear answer that the first answer is wrong. That's what I first come to. The first answer that feels clear is the answer that makes the parable no longer a parable. So that is the wrong answer. What's also the right answer, at least to this parable, the right answer up to this point is that the church is founded in parables that no longer allow the church to live in an us versus them dynamic. And isn't this exactly the life we've seen Jesus live up to this point? Jesus doesn't live in us versus them dynamic. neither of these answers, the answer that the first answer isn't right, the answer that the church is not meant to be in an us-them dynamic, neither of these answers actually give an answer to the parable, though. Those are for you to continue to wrestle with, and me. We press on through our parables, and lest we run into the danger of only picturing big things in the parables, and we grow impatient for those big things to take place. I can grow so impatient for the me that I dislike to finally be finished. Get this other Jason out of me. And I can grow impatient because I'm ready for big things to happen. But lest we get too impatient for the big things to happen, Jesus leads us next to the two parables that call upon us to resist despising the day of little things. After the two field parables, where there's a big field in mind, we come to the tiny parables, the seed parables, where a literal seed is being planted in the ground and the seed of yeast is being planted into flour. We begin with a tiny mustard seed that grows into a big plant. But as Julia said in her message, this parable foremost calls to our mind patience. It takes patience for that to happen. And so I'm getting impatient for big things, but now these next parables of Jesus are the small starts that will take time to come to big things. At a surface level, we, the church, we like to picture the mustard plant as us. We will grow to overshadow the world. We will grow to overshadow them who aren't part of our plant. And the wonderful birds will keep flocking to us, the amazing church. But I hope by now we're actually getting scared of what can feel like such an obvious reading. What other understandings of this parable might there be? We considered the problem of the birds last week. They are understood to be evil in the first parable. The birds are part of evil, and they steal the seeds of the kingdom out of our heart. So what if, just like the weeds of evil are in the two parables, what if the evil birds also cross into two parables? What if in the first parable the birds are people who tend to act as instruments of evil? What if these people tend to go around and they steal the good seeds out of people's hearts? The kingdom is sowing its good seeds, and there are people who fly like birds to eat the good seeds out of people. But what if the mustard seed is the church? And Jesus says in Matthew 13:32, it's the smallest of all the seeds, but when it's grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Notice they don't make nests in its branches until it's fully grown. What is Jesus saying? Is he saying that if the church will grow up into maturity, it will be a place that will actually draw the evil birds into it, and they'll find a home in it and be changed? What if a mature church is seen as a place that welcomes the people who otherwise are instruments of evil to steal good in this world? What if the mature church changes these birds so they're no longer out flying and stealing good seed, but they're resting in the church? Could this be an answer? Completely different idea, one that I like better. What if the mustard plant is the kingdom of heaven that grows in this world despite the church? What if the mustard tree is not even the church, but it is a kingdom of heaven that will grow despite the church or the churches? What if the kingdom of heaven is spreading out into this huge thing through the world, even when the church is not spreading or cannot spread? What if the stories in recent years of people around the world meeting Jesus in visions when they haven't even met someone from a church? What if that is the kingdom of heaven growing where there is no church to make it grow? So we can't take credit for being the plant. And what if the church is the birds who come to rest upon the kingdom? What if the kingdom is growing regardless of what we do? And we have a choice whether we will rest on it. Our choice, when we claim to be part of the church, is to decide, will we nest and live in the places where the kingdom is growing, whether we might like it or not, where it's growing? Joshua has this experience when he encounters an angel of the Lord. Joshua, he asks the angel, are you for me or against me? And the angel says neither. And the challenge of the angel to Joshua is not, I'm Joshua and I'm doing my thing. Do you have my back? But it is the power of heaven is doing its thing. Will you follow? What if the mustard plant is the power of the kingdom of heaven doing its thing? And the church, or churches like ours, we have to decide if we will make our home in the kingdom of heaven and where it's growing in this world. This idea takes away our independence. We're no longer the plant that gets to choose where and when we will grow and where we will take the kingdom. Our place, our existence is called to be where the kingdom is growing. We ask the powers of heaven, are you for me? And are you for what I am deciding should happen? But this reading of the parable requires that I must tune into the growth of the kingdom of heaven and decide what it is doing, and then figure out if I can or will follow. This idea clarifies Matthew 18:18 for us. It's been greatly misunderstood by the church. It's often translated as, truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth, it will be loosed in heaven. We read this as if we dictate things to God. I will choose what will be bound and loosed on earth, and then God does it too. The Greek has been realized to not actually mean this. Many Bibles are hesitant to change the translation because this is tradition. And many translations don't want to go against the mob that has learned this is what it should say. The tense of the Greek is too often translated will be. But the actual tense of the Greek is of an action that has already been done and now has results that are continuing into the future. So what Jesus is telling his disciples is that if they attempt to bind and loose something on earth and it works, then they will know they have enacted what has already happened in heaven. There's a whole list. These are many of the translations that have come to admit what this verse really means. It is saying, whatever you bind on earth, if you find it successful, then you have figured out what has been bound in heaven. If you loose something on earth, if you want to loose mercy and love somewhere and you see it work, that's what already happened in heaven. This reading requires us to understand what is happening in heaven, what has happened in heaven, and then carry it to earth. We don't direct heaven. Heaven directs us. The lesson of Joshua, the lesson of Matthew 18:18, and perhaps the lesson of the mustard seed is that heaven takes everything into account and will grow as it sees fit. We who call ourselves the church, we get to decide if we will take our place upon the branches of the kingdom of heaven, wherever they are growing. It's a work that we do not control. It grows of its own accord, and we decide if we will jump in. And Jesus says, those who aren't against me, those who aren't for me are against me. And if the idea of the birds crosses two parables, Perhaps what we're to understand is that if we are not a church making our home where the kingdom is, then we are inadvertently, as a church, among the birds of evil. And we will, even inadvertently, steal good seeds from people because we're not in touch with where the kingdom of heaven is growing, and we have not made our home there. At least if we see ourselves as the birds finding homes within the kingdom, we're still called by this parable to see ourselves as the same as the people who are the evil stealers of good seed. Time and again, the parables prevent me from placing myself as better than and over others. My field is the same as everyone else's. I have all four soils. My field is the same as everyone else's. I have good growing in me and I have weeds growing in me. Unless I mock those who are birds of evil, if the bird is the church, it's saying you're also the same creature as everyone else. You're a bird too. The parable says, you're a bird too, and you need to find a resting place. And now my heart empathizes for all the birds who are abused by evil out there doing the work of finding seeds when they could come just rest in the kingdom. These are two possible ideas of how much more deeply we can consider the parable of the mustard seed. As we move on to the parable of yeast, what if the yeast, like the mustard plant, is a kingdom that lives of its own right? I don't control it. And what if Jesus is the perfect baker, personified, to some horrors, as a woman? What if Jesus is the female baker of the bread? Jesus is the one who is perceived as making the match between the yeast of the kingdom and the flour of humanity. And what if the lesson of the parable is that we are not the baker who is called upon to go yeast the world like so many Christians try to do? We of the church are part of the flour. We're the part of the flour that has been yeasted. And what if our job is to simply be the part of the world that has been yeasted, so that then the yeast can move on from us and go to work on the rest of the flour? Do you see the difference in the mindset? I like to think of myself as the baker. And I go out to actively put yeast on other people. You're flour, and I'm the baker carrying the yeast. Let's make this happen. This is the evangelism of hellfire and brimstone that seeks to use the powers of this world to advance the kingdom. The powers of fear, the powers of self-interest, the powers of greed. As evangelicalism places themselves as the baker, it turns into an us versus them mindset. As I separate myself from the world, I'm not like them. They're flour, but I'm the baker. And I've been gifted the yeast. I'm not like them. Even worse is to believe that I'm the yeast. The baker just arranges the introduction between the flour and the yeast. The yeast itself sees itself as an active agent sent to change others. I'm the yeast and you will be changed by me. Even more than the baker, if I believe that I am the yeast of the world, I will live in an us versus them mindset. But Jesus' two field parables remind us that we're no better than anyone else. There's good and bad in all of us. And this parable says that I am the same flour makeup as anybody else. And if I will let the kingdom yeast me, change me, beginning with the yeasting work of the parables, then the yeast will move from me to others as the kingdom chooses, not as I try to dictate. I'm never called to be the baker and choose what flour is to meet the yeast and just try to push it together, because I'm not over anyone else. If we think the answer to the parable of yeast is somewhere in the direction of us versus them, it will change how we see the world, and we will not treat others as peers, as fellow images of God. But again, I have half a dozen other possible ways to picture the tiny parables, the seed parables. So I can't claim to have mastered the big or the little parables. What I can claim is that these ideas that come from my wrestling have shaped me greatly. As I wrestle with the parables, these ideas shape how I see myself. They shape how I see myself in relation to others. They shape how I understand my place with the kingdom of heaven. They shape how I understand the direction that I am to bring this church to the best of my ability. They shape how I speak to the church. How I read these parables is why I continue in my own language to try to purge the word sermon from my language. I don't offer a Sunday sermon because I'm not trying to preach over anyone else. I'm the same as everyone else. What I may offer on a Sunday is a message that is born from my own yeasting. A yeasting at the gentle hands of my loving baker. So maybe I offer a message. I'm not preaching at anyone. And maybe how I live the message that I carry as part of the flour being yeasted by the kingdom, maybe it makes other people as flour say, I want to join what's happening in that loaf over there. But then, if Jesus is the baker and the yeast is the kingdom of heaven, and if I'm to understand that I am positionally being prevented from placing myself as any different than anyone else in the world, then if I'm flour, the rest of the world is flour. If all humanity is flour, and they're no better or worse than me, and it's into the flour that Jesus has placed the kingdom, then there's never been a time that any human has not been part of what Jesus is baking. Jesus has introduced the yeast into the flour of humanity so that we are all part of the loaf that Jesus is making. Humans simply exist, though, as those who have been yeasted and those who haven't been yeasted yet. The exploration could go on, but we're out of time. You're going to hear the kids come back in. The yeast rose in my message, and I ran out of space. Seriously, though, as the church is supposed to be the part of the world that is yeasted, and as Jesus makes what the parables do to us, as Jesus makes the parables foundational to our yeasting, knowing how to wrestle with the parables and wrestling with them is foundational to being part of the church. I pray that this extra chance to approach the first 4 parables, it's with a couple twists thrown in. What if we aren't even the tree? What if we aren't the yeast? What if what's happening is out of our control and we are only called to decide if we'll follow? Pray that this extra chance to consider these first 4 parables, it will serve you as we move on to what is ahead in Matthew's gospel. I'm going to invite you, in light of what is now 5 weeks spent introducing ourselves to the parables, decide if you want to grab. I printed out the other 3 parables that we will be talking about next week and some questions. And with this new idea of the parables, I invite you to grab a printed copy on the way out. For those watching online, I put a link to a PDF, so you can download the PDF from there. Take this copy of the final 3 parables and consider letting them yeast you. Let them act upon you. Let them show you where possibly the tree of the kingdom of heaven is growing, and you're invited to make a nest. Experience with this your own time of realizing the field of your life, of resting in the branches of the kingdom, of being yeasted by the parables, and enjoy your own time before then you come back and you hear what I might think of this, whether it's right or wrong. As the kids are going to come back, We're going to come to close today with worship of our God. It's worship of a God who says, I'm not looking for memorization. I'm not looking for your own mastery of the subject. I'm looking to lead you into wisdom. And as I lead you, you will fully experience my love. So we're going to have Nate come up and close us. And as you worship, would you picture that God who, he's not demanding the right answers. He's demanding, through the parables, he's demanding a choice. The parables call into question a choice. Will we trust Jesus, who loves us, even when we don't understand him? Bonhoeffer's the one who said that the parables bring us to demand a choice. The parables demand that we choose, do we trust the voice or do we trust our own mastery of the answers? So as we come to worship, that's our choice today. Can we let go of the weight of answers and take the light and easy yoke of Jesus and let his hand guide us?